The 18th century in Europe was a dynamic period of rapid change, drastic development, and revolutionary upheaval. It was a century full of warfare with a multitude of conflicts that could indeed be designated as world wars. During this century, Europe witnessed significant increase in population, a decline in outbreaks of the plague, and at last a surplus rather than a shortage of food. The religious fervor that engulfed Europe into debate and conflict since the outbreak of the Reformation died down in the 18th century as many Europeans embraced alternatives to Christian doctrines, explored alternative philosophies, and scorned the debates over dogma that often led to armed conflict. 18th century Europe, however, would best be remembered as a century of new political ideas that led to significant revolutions. The American Revolution, followed by the French Revolution, were, in many ways, the climaxes of the century and had massive, far-reaching implications. The 18th century can be designated as the century of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, for these two events drew together so many of the larger trends of the age. It is useful to date this time period as commencing in 1700 and concluding with the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, which signaled the end of the intellectual movement as well as the original French Revolution. The Enlightenment is the designation that many writers and historians have given to the intellectual movement that became popular in Europe throughout the 18th century. The term, probably stemming from the writings of Immanuel Kant, indicated a clear philosophical break and rejection of the ideological and theological priorities of past Europeans, and signaled the belief that man had entered a new era with a firm belief in his intellectual powers. European scholars, writers, politicians, and even monarchs and working class members liked to think of themselves as overcoming the ignorance of their predecessors and embracing a smarter, brighter, more reasonable approach to life. The intellectual movement of the Enlightenment was certainly a world-changing and European-defining event with massive repercussions for centuries to come. But even some practitioners of the new way of thinking realized in the end that Europe's new philosophers were not as smart as they thought they were, and watched with alarm as some of their very own new ideas ended up consuming their societies and even leading to some of their own imprisonments and deaths. There were a multitude of causes that led to the Enlightenment and an abundance of factors that led to its growth, but a few are worth particularly noting. The humanism of the Renaissance, which for the first time elevated the attention of Europeans towards the dignity and power of human beings, in many ways became even more expansive and popular during the 18th century Enlightenment. The Enlightenment's philosophers went beyond simply celebrating the dignity of humans and proceeded to venerate man's ability to think and reason and solve his own problems. The power of the human and his mind was a cardinal tenet during the 18th century. Without question, the theological debates and conflicts of the Reformation era 16th century also had a profound effect on Europeans. By the 18th century, many commentators saw the Reformation as a wasted time of irrelevant doctrinal debates that only led to violence and warfare. Fatigued with dogma and destruction prompted many to find a new point of emphasis, and they found it in philosophical debate and thought. The scientific revolution of the 17th century was also a huge boon to thinkers in the 18th century. Philosophers in the 18th century loved to discuss recent discoveries and stylize themselves as scientists, if not in biology, chemistry, and physics, then at least in society, politics, and economics. Finally, in the age of absolutism, without question, spurred philosophers to ponder the great questions of government during their age. After 100 years of political oppression by European monarchs and a near total absence of representative government, many European thinkers looked for a better means to constitute a civil society and frame of government. While hereditary monarchy that lived lavishly on the backs of the common people continued to endure into the 18th century, particularly in France, it was clear that absolutism was quickly losing its appeal and its claims to power. Across Europe, writers and thinkers sought a better way to design a government. There were several significant themes that are important to identify as part of the Enlightenment. Without question, man's ability to reason was the primary focus of the movement. According to the philosophers of the age, man's ability to think, ponder, and consider problems and design and create and discover was his highest attribute. This was a radical departure from the medieval period's emphasis on man as a sinful creature who was doomed to receive the wrath of God. It was certainly a departure away from the theological debates and research of the Reformation, which believed revelations of truth were from God alone and found in the Scriptures, not in man's head. The Enlightenment's emphasis on reason was also even a departure, or at least an expansion, of the Renaissance, because whereas humanists during the Renaissance emphasized man's spiritual and physical dignity and beauty, they did not place near exclusive emphasis on his ability to think and cognitively work out his problems. Enlightenment reason also replaced the belief that an absolutist king was the source of all knowledge and insight. The veneration of reason during the Enlightenment stemmed from the philosophers' obsession with the 17th century scientific revolution. 18th century philosophers considered 17th century scientists to be heroes for their belief in the empirical and their ability to prove and disprove assertions through their experiments. In truth, most of the philosophers of the Enlightenment probably did not read the works of Kepler, Galileo, or Newton because they could not understand them, but they liked to talk like they did. They liked to pretend they were in the same league as these scientists, that they too were making major discoveries in the societal and political arena. From the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment thinkers adopted a strong belief in natural law, the idea that, just like Newton's laws of gravity, the entire universe and everything in it is governed by laws established by nature, and they can be discernible, studied, and adhered to. Whereas Newton busied himself with simply identifying scientific laws of gravity and light, the philosophers of the 18th century extrapolated Newton's mechanical physics to every walk of life. Thus, the philosophers wrote extensively endeavoring to discern the true and natural laws of what they believed to exist in politics, economics, religion, history, and society. In short, they over-applied Newton's systems and thoughts in a manner Newton never intended. The quest to discern the natural laws in every area of life was also coupled with a fascination with what 18th century thinkers called the state of nature. The state of nature referred to man's original condition before he was overcomplicated and corrupted by society, corrupt governments, superstitious religions, and artificially contrived morals. Coming off the Age of Discovery, Enlightenment thinkers believed Europeans could capture a glimpse of what man's state of nature looked like in the remote tribes of Africa or Native American culture in the Americas. On these two continents, previously deemed unsophisticated, were wonderful communities of what living close to nature looked like and what man's purity could be if uninhibited by absolutist monarchs and dogmatic priests. The more philosophers discovered natural law, they believed they would return man to a state of nature. Adoration of man's reason and the powers of science was coupled with a strong skepticism of traditional faith systems and historic Christianity. Established and long-held Christian doctrines, such as the Trinity, the divinity of Christ, the exclusivity of salvation through Christ, the historicity and inerrancy of the Bible, were all either called into question or outright rejected. Often mixed in with this new skepticism was a belief in deism, that espoused there was no Trinity or divine Christ, but only a remote, supreme being who created the world and its natural laws and then stepped back and watched. There is no intervening personal God. There is no daily providence in our lives. The common description of the supreme being was that he was a great clockmaker who made the world, wound it up, and then never touched it again, but still watches it from afar. This new skepticism of Christianity led to a belief in cultural relativism, that Europeans needed to give up on the idea that Christianity was the only true faith, and that rather all societies, even primitive tribes, have religious truth and reason that does not get superseded by Christianity. The areas of study and contemplation for the Enlightenment philosophers were numerous. They conducted broad studies of society, approaches to education and the parenting of children, the necessity of freedom in the economic market, humane approaches to criminal justice, and most importantly, they sought out the natural laws they believed to have existed regarding the origin, nature, and role of perfect government. These are the themes and topics that consumed their conversations in the 18th century. There were many different venues and forums in which Enlightenment ideas were introduced and discussed. Aspiring or established thinkers and writers would gather in coffee houses to discuss their ideas or their recent writings. Debating societies flourished in London, Glasgow, and Paris, which provided a more formal venue for the development of ideas. Freemasonry, which started as a 13th century workers' guild, evolved into an exclusive and secret society for well-connected members and provided another format for the discussion of the new ideas. The most popular or famous of these locations for the Enlightenment were salons. Salons were large dinner parties or social gatherings that were usually hosted by a wealthy patron, even a notable aristocrat in their homes. Local intellectuals would be invited to debate political and societal ideas, perhaps accompanied by food, drink, music, and societal networking. The salons of Paris became the most famous as venues for the Enlightenment, featuring major figures of the age, including Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot. There were several famous hostesses of salons, particularly in Paris during the Enlightenment. Madame Geoffrin may have been the most famous. Her salons, held on Rue de Saint-Honoré in Paris, became exclusive events held twice each week on Mondays and Wednesdays. Mondays she would host musicians and artists, and Wednesdays men of letters, usually thinkers and writers. She was well known for her graciousness, attention to detail, gift-giving, and hospitality. Another famous salon hostess during the Enlightenment was Madame de Staël. She was the daughter of the French finance minister Jacques Necker and was well educated as a woman for the time. She corresponded extensively with leading intellectuals and was particularly enthralled with Rousseau and Montesquieu. Madame de Staël's mother, Madame Necker, was also a notable host during the Enlightenment. She traveled in elite circles due to the position of her husband. The center of attention during the Enlightenment was the philosophe. The philosophe, which is French for philosopher, replaced the theologian of the Reformation as the esteemed intellectual profession of Europe during the Enlightenment. There were many philosophes across Europe during the Enlightenment. Once reason and man's ability to think became the cardinal virtue of the age, it seemed like everyone had a new idea or was publishing a new book about government, economics, society, or mankind. While quite a few claimed to be philosophes during the Enlightenment, it is worthwhile examining some of the more notable thinkers of the age in more detail. A premier forerunner in the lead-up to the Enlightenment was Denis Diderot. Diderot originally studied to be a Jesuit and was on track to enter the Catholic clergy of France, but his growing skepticism of Christianity led him to abandon the clergy and pursue a legal education. His father disowned him when he announced he intended to become a writer. Diderot became a proficient freelance writer who mastered several languages and preferred to write works of fiction. His most notable work, however, was as co-founder and contributor to the creation of the first encyclopedia, known as the Encyclopédie. His works revealed an increasing skepticism of Christianity, in which he referred to Christianity as, quote, the most absurd and most atrocious in its dogma, unquote. He was imprisoned briefly by French authorities for such attacks on the established Catholic Church. Diderot struggled with money problems throughout his life and was nearly destitute until Catherine the Great of Russia purchased his entire library and hired him to annually steward the collection. Diderot spent time at Catherine's court in St. Petersburg, espousing new ideas and impressing the Empress of Russia. The Encyclopédie eventually swelled to 28 enormous volumes. Although the modern encyclopedia is known for being a dictionary of knowledge and supposed to contain objective and informative articles on various subjects, Diderot's Encyclopédie included such entries, but also numerous opinionated articles submitted by philosophes. Articles address contemporary debates on various social, legal, and political issues. The Encyclopédie, with its new attention to knowledge and man's ability to reason through his problems, made it a formative work for the Enlightenment and a prime example of the philosophes' priorities. Another notable figure in the early Enlightenment was the German philosophe Immanuel Kant. Kant's work was so extensive and groundbreaking, he is often considered the greatest luminary of the Enlightenment, but the difficulty in understanding his writings often makes him remote and unadaptable. Born in Königsberg in the Kingdom of Prussia, Kant was raised in a strict Lutheran home and demonstrated an early interest and propensity for mathematics and science. He studied at the University of Königsberg, where he spent his entire career. Kant wrote extensively and significantly developed the primary arenas of philosophy, including epistemology, the science of knowing, metaphysics, the study of reality, ethics, the study of what is right and good, and aesthetics, the study of beauty. Kant never married and was known to be a bit of a recluse, yet he was very predictable and mathematical in his thinking and habits. His neighbors remarked that they could set their watches according to the daily regular time he took his walks. Although he did not marry or sire children, Kant did maintain a regular social life and interacted with other thinkers. Kant defined the Enlightenment as, quote, man's leaving his self-caused immaturity, unquote. The implication in his thought that until the Enlightenment, man had chosen ignorance and superstition and religious silliness rather than fully exercising his intellectual powers. But now, man could enter a new world through the power of reason. Kant famously wrote, quote, dare to know, have the courage to use your own intelligence, unquote. Kant's most famous work was The Critique of Pure Reason, published in 1781. In this massive 800-page work, which many readers found enormously cumbersome, Kant celebrated man's ability to reason in Newton's mechanical universe and theorized regarding the nature of the universe, reality, and man's ability to understand it. Kant elevated man's reason to an unprecedented height, even surpassing a focus on the exterior, pre-existing creation of God. It is man who has the ability to understand his world, and man that can bring definition to that world. Kant spoke similarly in regards to ethics and aesthetics. Whereas the categorical imperative may exist, basic commands of right and wrong, they can still be discovered by man's reason, and not by relying on a religious or societal source such as a holy book or royal decrees. In many ways, Kant opened the door for many other philosophes to follow by inviting them to see their own reason and ability to think as their own personal guiding light. If Immanuel Kant was the greatest reclusive thinker of the Enlightenment, François-Marie Arouet, better known as Voltaire, was the Enlightenment's most public and most popular philosophe. Voltaire was so important to the Enlightenment that the entire age is sometimes nicknamed the Age of Voltaire. Voltaire, which was his adopted pen name, was famous for his sarcastic wit and criticism of the French monarchy and the Roman Catholic Church. The same wit that endeared him to millions also earned him the contempt of French authorities. Voltaire was the child of a minor French nobleman and received a Jesuit education. His father wanted him to be a lawyer, but Voltaire defied his father and dreamed of being a writer. Voltaire's sarcastic wit often got him into trouble with Parisian authorities, and twice he was imprisoned and once exiled to England. Voltaire was imprisoned in the Bastille from May 16, 1717 to April 15, 1718 in a windowless cell with 10-foot thick walls. Voltaire was a strong advocate of civil liberties, particularly the right to say and publish whatever one wished. He strongly opposed religious intolerance and was a harsh critic of an absolute monarchy or the privileges of the Catholic clergy in France. Voltaire spent 2.5 years in exile in England, and afterwards he published his popular Letters on the English. In 1734, Voltaire admired the British constitutional monarchy, the limits placed on the monarchy after the English Civil War and Glorious Revolution, and drew sharp contrasts with the absolute monarchy of the Bourbons that ruled France. Voltaire expressed great admiration for the freedom of speech and press and assembly in England, again drawing a contrast with his native France and its repression of civil liberties. Voltaire's Letters on the English was one of the strongest statements among the philosophes, who frequently praised England at the expense of France and publicly called for France to be more like England. Parisian authorities reacted negatively to Voltaire's praise of England and publicly burned copies, forcing Voltaire to flee the city once again. In approximately 1733, Voltaire took as his mistress the brilliant Émilie du Châtelet, the Marquise de Châtelet. Châtelet was married and the mother of 3 children, and 12 years younger than Voltaire, but their attraction stemmed from their mutual love of science and scholarship. The two performed scientific experiments together, collected books, and urged each other on in their writings. The Marquise Chateau provided a refuge for the controversial Voltaire, and Voltaire encouraged the Marquise in her understanding and translation of Isaac Newton's work, The Principia. As Voltaire's stardom became more international, he grew bored with the Marquise and eventually moved out, taking next as his lover his niece, with whom Voltaire lived with pretty much until the end of his life. Frederick the Great, the Emperor of Prussia, took a great interest in Voltaire and his works. After frequently corresponding with the philosophe, Frederick invited Voltaire to his court and his palace at Sanssouci and Potsdam outside of Berlin. In this painting, guests of Frederick the Great at Sanssouci dined with Voltaire, including members of the Prussian Academy of Sciences. Voltaire is in purple and seated third from the left. Although Frederick was genuinely intrigued by Voltaire, the French philosophe was also a convenient prop for the absolutist monarch of Prussia, who hoped to advertise himself as more of an enlightened monarch than his European rivals. Frederick gave Voltaire a living stipend and celebrated him, but the move to Prussia did not last long. Voltaire fell into arguments with other members of Frederick's court, which led to Voltaire's desire to return to France. By this time, however, Voltaire's reputation was considered so incendiary that King Louis XV of France banned him from Paris. Voltaire endeavored to settle in Geneva, but fell into conflict with the Swiss Calvinists there. Voltaire therefore landed back in France on the Swiss border at a town called Ferney. Voltaire purchased a large estate in Ferney, where he would remain for the rest of his life. Later, the town would be renamed in his honor, after its most famous resident becoming known as Ferney-Voltaire in 1878. At Ferney, Voltaire entertained other Enlightenment notables, including Edward Gibbon and Adam Smith. It was also at Ferney later in life that Voltaire published probably his most famous work, In Candide, or also named Optimism. Candide was Voltaire's most sarcastic work, using a humorous narrative story to poke fun at the optimism and positive determinism of the age. Horrible experiences continue to happen to the book's main characters, yet they always remain positive and optimistic, refusing to properly assess reality. Voltaire also published his Dictionnaire philosophique, which was a sustained attack against the Catholic Church and dogmatic Christianity. Voltaire was a deist who believed that belief in a deity was an easy exercise of reason and not truly an exercise of faith. Voltaire also repeatedly used the phrase écrasez l'enfant in his private letters in 1759 and then continued thereafter. Écrasez l'enfant, in French meaning crush the infamous thing, or crush the monster, was a useful jingle to attack the power of the Roman Catholic Church and the power the clergy enjoyed in France. Near the end of his life, Voltaire returned to Paris for the first time in 25 years. in 1778 to attend the performance of one of his many plays. Voltaire died at the age of 83 in a Parisian home. There are conflicting accounts regarding his death. Some say he called for a priest on his deathbed and repented of his disbelief, and others claim he was defiant to the end. As a critic of the Catholic Church, Voltaire was originally denied a Christian burial. During the French Revolution, Voltaire's remains were removed to the Pantheon in Paris, a high honor for France's greatest citizens. Over 1 million viewers lined the route leading to the Pantheon during the Revolution to honor the famous and witty writer. Voltaire received such a celebrated funeral and burial because his ideas lived on and were granted great esteem during the French Revolution, and Voltaire is remembered as a witty and sarcastic critic of political and religious overreach. The other notable luminary and public intellectual, perhaps equally esteemed as Voltaire during the age, was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau, like Voltaire, wrote extensively and was a frequent political and social commentator. His ideas, once again like Voltaire's, were not fully accepted or celebrated until the outbreak of the French Revolution. Thereafter, Rousseau's ideas were held in high regard and became fundamental principles of a modern and more liberalized modern Europe. Rousseau was born in the Swiss Calvinist city-state of Geneva. Since John Calvin's work in the city 200 years earlier, Geneva had remained a Protestant stronghold and a destination for many political and religious refugees from across Europe. Although citizens could vote in the Republic of Geneva, only a few of the wealthiest families actually enjoyed the power. Resentment grew between the voting oligarchy of merchant families and the refugees and working class that also inhabited the city. Some of Rousseau's nearest relatives had waded into these political squabbles, and thus a protest against the power and assertion of power ran in the family name of Rousseau. Rousseau was born in Geneva in 1712, and his mother died 9 days after his birth. His father was a Swiss watchmaker, and thus Rousseau grew up among the working class in Geneva, surrounded by the tension and resentment of the artisans against the merchant oligarchy. Rousseau's father got into trouble with local authorities, remarried, and left for France with his new wife, leaving Jean-Jacques with an uncle. The uncle, who was a Protestant minister, introduced Rousseau to mathematics, but also spirituality. Rousseau actually contemplating becoming a Protestant minister. Rousseau was an apprentice to an abusive engraver who beat him, causing him to flee Geneva to neighboring Savoy, France. Essentially abandoned now by his father and uncle, Rousseau sought work as a traveling tutor in Piedmont in Savoy. In the area, Rousseau met Françoise Louise de Warren. Madame Warren came from a Protestant family, but had annulled her marriage to her husband and converted to Catholicism. She received a stipend from the King of Piedmont as a professional proselytizer, who was paid to convert Protestants in and around Geneva to Catholicism. She took in the young man Rousseau and became his benefactor, and despite being nearly 13 years her junior, they became lovers. Madame de Warens took other lovers as well, which confused the young Rousseau, but Madame Warens introduced Rousseau to the world of ideas through her library, lavish parties, dinner guests, and love of music and art. Rousseau thereafter moved to Paris and befriended Diderot, and engaged with the new enlightened ideas that were becoming increasingly popular in France. While Rousseau pursued a writing career, he took a Parisian chambermaid as his mistress. Rousseau thereafter moved to Paris and befriended Diderot and engaged with the new enlightened ideas that were becoming increasingly popular in France. While Rousseau pursued a writing career, he took a Parisian chambermaid as his mistress named Marie-Thérèse Levasseur. According to Rousseau's writings, Levasseur bore him a son and 4 other children. All 5 of the children were left at a foundling hospital in Paris because Rousseau feared the children would follow the example of their mother's upbringing and be poorly educated. He believed they would be better educated at an orphanage. Rousseau enjoyed the cultural life of Paris, wrote articles for Diderot's Encyclopédie, and commented on the arts and music. He increasingly developed his ideas regarding the fundamental goodness of man. It was in Paris, as Rousseau enjoyed the ease and comfort that came from having wealthy nobles as his benefactors, that he composed and published his most famous works. Yet his increased advocacy for religious pluralism, his rejection of original sin and divine revelation, incurred the anger of both Catholic and Protestant authorities. His books were burned in Geneva, and a warrant was issued for his arrest in France. Despite his Swiss Protestant upbringing, Rousseau rejected the ideas of original sin, total depravity, and man's fallen nature. In his popular work, Discourse on Inequality, Rousseau asserted man in his original state was a happy, noble, and fundamentally good creature. The corruption of society, rather than the fallenness of man's soul, occurred with the development of private property and institutions that establish one class against another. The development of trades such as agriculture and metallurgy only further antagonized one man against another, and the purity of man's existence was lost. Rousseau would remain a lifelong critic of wealth, privilege, luxury, and indulgence. The ability for man to think, reason, imagine, and contemplate the deeper meaning of life, however, was not lost in the development of civilization, but remains buried in the human heart. Rousseau's strong belief in an original, uncorrupted state of nature can be summarized in his famous quote, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." Unquote. Rousseau's belief that individuals can create and define themselves, as well as his broad use of the concept of inequality, would become long-standing ideas in modern Western civilization. One of Rousseau's most enduring works was The Social Contract, in which he describes man's journey from the state of nature to the creation of civil society. Recognizing the need to organize society, men come together to form a government. Power resides with the general will of the people in a state, and they give power to magistrates or officials in expectation that man will be ordered, protected, and recipients of their benevolence. Rousseau was an advocate of the classical republicanism of previous ages and believed small city-states, such as in Switzerland, were the ideal size for a state. He advocated direct democracy rather than representative bodies, thus people would vote for magistrates and then quickly vote them out when they found them to be in error. Rousseau heavily borrowed from the concepts of the monarchomaques, that is, the right of resistance arguments developed by the French Huguenots. His concept of the social contract also borrowed heavily from Thomas Hobbes. Essentially, Rousseau's social contract was a newer presentation of the ideas stemming from the Reformation, but absent of their theology or biblical roots. Thomas Jefferson would borrow heavily from Rousseau's social contract in his composition of the Declaration of Independence for the American colonies. Among Rousseau's most controversial books, his ideas on education, usually entitled Émile, provoked a strong reaction from French and Swiss authorities during his lifetime. The reason for the public burnings of Émile was because it rejected the concepts of original sin and the fallen nature of man. Rousseau asserted the natural goodness of children and the possibility of their perfection through reason. Rousseau saw danger in the institutions of the church and typical parents who discipline their children, stuff their heads with superstitious theology, and require them to conform to the usual patterns of work and church. Rather, in homage to his belief in the state of nature, children should be allowed to develop naturally, perhaps even in a natural environment, in the country, or even in the woods, under the direction of a tutor. The tutor would provide challenges and problems for the child to survive, which would result in the development of their own minds and reason. Parents and priests would not be allowed to impair their development. According to Rousseau, the child would develop naturally, would not be corrupted by societal institutions. Only then they would be ready to rejoin society and contribute to its reasonable refinement. Rousseau did not outright reject religion, the Bible, or belief in God, yet he believed the institution of the church had corrupted these concepts. In anticipation of the 19th century Romantics, chose to see God and spirituality in nature rather than in doctrines or dogma. There are many similarities between Rousseau's thought and modern child-centered theories of education. Many at the time, however, saw his theories as empowering ignorance and rebellion among children. Due to the controversy surrounding his writings, Rousseau continued to move frequently. He enjoyed 2 years of patronage by Frederick the Great, even as he continued to criticize the King of Prussia. Rousseau moved back to Geneva and then fled again. He moved to Moutiers in Switzerland until he was driven out again by local leadership and his own pastor. He also lived in Bern and Strasbourg before receiving an invitation from David Hume to come to England. Hume spent over a year in England and sought solitude against the warrant issued for his arrest. Rousseau returned to France and then lived for a spell in Paris, Lyon, and Grenoble. He ended his wanderings in Paris, living in a lower-class neighborhood and continuing to write. In his latter years, Rousseau composed his work Confessions. The work was essentially an autobiography and was not published until after his death. Some critics question the veracity of some of Rousseau's details in the work, but there is no question that Rousseau's work gave birth to the modern non-religious autobiography and elevated the individual and his story in modern thought. Rousseau secretly married Levasseur and expressed regret at abandoning his children to the orphanage. After a series of repeated falls and a stroke, Rousseau died on July 2, 1778. Rousseau's stardom that commenced during his lifetime only expanded after his death. He became a primary icon and voice of the French Revolution that broke out shortly after he died. His remains were moved and interned in the Pantheon in 1794. An Englishman who played a significant role as a political theorist for Enlightenment thinkers was John Locke. Locke was born near Bristol, England, and was the child of Puritan parents who believed strongly in education. Locke earned bachelor's and master's degrees at Oxford, studying classical works and philosophy, but he also earned a degree in medicine. Lord Ashley, who served in senior political office in the English Protectorate and the restored monarchy of Charles II, hired Locke as his personal physician and heavily influenced him. Locke was only loosely connected to the major political events of his life, including the English Civil War, the Restoration, and the Glorious Revolution, but they no doubt had a profound effect on him and his writings. His extended family and immediate ancestors had broad Huguenot roots, and it is evident that the thinking of the monarchomaques and the Huguenot right of resistance pops up in Locke's own thought. Locke's premier political work were his 2 treatises of government. In his first treatise on government, Locke rejects arguments that assert that divine right of kings and that monarchies are endorsed by God himself. It was his second treatise on government, however, that became his pivotal and often cited work. The essay sounds similar to Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan in its discussion of man's state of nature and the resulting contractual origins of government, but the work diverges on several key points. Locke does not believe man is an evil brute in his original state of nature, but rather that he is a creature endowed with reason and a blank canvas with which to work. Using his reason, he crafts with other men a government whose sovereignty stems from the people itself. Locke believes in distributing power into various branches of government and the need for representative bodies. Locke was also a fervent advocate for property rights and believed that property was a natural right and protection of it one of the foremost duties of the state. Power is given to the government to protect the people and to be used for the benevolence of the population. When a government fails to meet this goal, it is the right of the people to resist tyranny and remove it, installing another in its place. This type of justification of revolution was certainly groundbreaking and demonstrated influences from the 16th century monarchomaques and the Huguenot right of resistance. Voltaire and Rousseau would both reference Locke in their own writings. The American revolutionaries, including James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, frequently read and quoted Locke. In fact, Jefferson's Declaration of Independence is heavily based on Locke's second treatise of government, and particularly the phrase, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, is almost a verbatim quote from Locke himself. John Locke was also a consequential theorist regarding education. Although he believed in man's original state of nature, he did not believe that man was a murderous, thieving monster left to himself, like Hobbes did. Rather, man in a state of nature has a mind that is a tabula rasa, or a blank slate, waiting to be etched upon by experience, reason, and discovery. Parents and schools should therefore take care in what they endeavor to etch upon a child's mind, and should ensure that it is reasonable, wise, and truthful. Locke elevated the solitary thinking individual and is often credited with creating the modern concept of the self and promoting a strong sense of individuality in modern man. Another pivotal Englishman who made a significant contribution to the political conversations of the 18th century was William Blackstone. Educated at Oxford University and a member of Parliament, Blackstone is best remembered as the premier jurist, legal thinker, and commentator in English history and perhaps in world history. Blackstone's seminal work was his Commentaries on the Laws of England, published in multiple volumes over the course of 5 years. Blackstone's genius was to bring a substantive clarity to English common law which was hitherto unknown. Blackstone's efforts were so profound that nearly every aspiring lawyer in the English-speaking world sought copies of Blackstone's commentaries. Blackstone is credited with heavily influencing the thought and writings of Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, John Adams, John Marshall, and Abraham Lincoln. Blackstone's commentaries are still frequently cited in the United States Supreme Court decisions today. Besides Rousseau and Locke, one of the premier political thinkers during the Age of Enlightenment was Charles Louis de Secondat, better known as the Baron de Montesquieu. Montesquieu came from nobility on both sides of his parents. He also had strong Huguenot heritage among his ancestors and was disposed towards Protestantism, even marrying a Protestant. Montesquieu enjoyed widespread praise and celebration of his works during his lifetime, except of course from the Roman Catholic Church and absolutist monarchs who viewed his writings with great suspicion or alarm. Montesquieu's greatest work, which he published anonymously, was The Spirit of the Laws. This work became a staple in Western political thought and has been referenced ever since any time revolutionary forces of liberty want to point out tyranny within an established regime. What Montesquieu highlighted was that there are, in any government, 3 powers of government. They are the executive power to make laws, the legislative power to create laws, and the judicial power to interpret laws. Montesquieu pointed out that states become repressive and liberty justified when even a portion of a government combines more than one of these powers unto themselves. For example, Louis XIV's monarchy was absolute because Louis had the power to create laws by issuing royal decrees. He had the power to enforce those laws by the power of royal troops and servants. And he had the power to interpret the laws he created because he controlled all the courts and appointed all the royal judges. All 3 powers of government were confined in the person of the king, generating tyranny. Montesquieu gave rise to the separation of powers doctrine, the principle that no one body in a government gets to control more than one power. A representative body should make the laws, holding the legislative power. A sovereign, whether it be a king, prime minister, or a president, ought to hold the executive power and enforce the law. An independent judiciary should hold the power to interpret laws. Montesquieu traveled to England and held high praise for the English system of government stemming from the Civil War and Glorious Revolution. Montesquieu's writings were extensively studied by the American founding fathers, including James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. In fact, after the Bible itself, Montesquieu was the most often quoted political writer in the American colonies on the eve of the American Revolution. Quite significantly, Montesquieu's ideas were lauded by many in France, particularly by those who had grown tired of French absolutism and the decadent monarchy. Montesquieu would be a guiding light for the French revolutionaries that would turn over France in the coming decades. He remains one of the most significant philosophers and political scientists of all time. Besides political philosophy and questions of statecraft, the philosophers also took a great interest in the nascent field of economics. The philosophers considered whether or not there was a scientific means to promote a state's economy, and what natural laws could be identified that regulated the exchange of goods and led to prosperity for nations and individuals. Throughout the early modern period, and particularly during the age of absolutism, the prevailing economic theory was mercantilism. Mercantilism was a top-down approach to economic management, which once again placed the king and national interests at the top and gave the monarch abundant power to regulate trade and prosperity. Mercantilism was based on the assumption that the more gold a nation accrued, the better. It assumed that the creation of colonies would promote the wealth of the mother country, and it opposed free trade, imposing tariffs, tolls, and turnpikes that inhibited trade and supposedly generated more wealth for the crown and the state. A group of early French economists spoke harshly of the assumptions upon which mercantilism was based and began to propose new ideas, known as the physiocrats. These economists rejected the mercantilist theory that wealth is based on gold and proposed that labor determines the value of a good, with agricultural labor being the greatest source of wealth. They were known as the physiocrats because they believed that which is physical, namely land, was the source of true wealth, not accruing endless piles of gold and silver. Land, according to the physiocrats, generated more wealth in the form of crops and could reproduce its product each year. After all, you can't eat gold, you can eat the product of the land. The physiocrats prized individualism, private property, and individual labor that marked a stark break with the control and centrism of the established mercantilist system. One of the leading lights among the physiocrats was François Quesnay. Quesnay was trained in medicine and eventually became the personal surgeon of King Louis XV. The king was impressed by Quesnay and frequently sought his counsel. Quesnay took a rare interest in the science of economics and began tabulating trade figures, output numbers, and consumption data. Although usually ignored because of how dry and boring his work was, Quesnay's tableaux économiques were some of the first economic tables, raw data that empowered other economic theorists. Quesnay essentially turned economics into a science based on empirical data. While largely forgotten today, Quesnay was essential for the founders of modern capitalism who came after him, the most important being Adam Smith himself. The Scottish economist Adam Smith is arguably the most significant economic thinker in world history. So profound were his contributions that some have dubbed him the father of economics, or at least the father of capitalism. Smith was one of the premier thinkers of his age and gave particularly the Scottish Enlightenment enormous credibility. He was the first to identify and treat economics as a unique academic discipline, and deftly applied the Enlightenment's interest in natural law to the study of political economy. Adam Smith was born in Kirkcaldy in Fife, Scotland, in 1723. Smith's parents were not wealthy, but were comfortable. Smith's father was a solicitor and a comptroller in Kirkcaldy. His mother was from the landed gentry class. 2 months before Smith was born, his father died. Thus Smith was raised by his mother, from whom he probably inherited his enormous intellectual gifts. Smith received a fine secondary education and then enrolled in the University of Glasgow at the age of 14. He pursued studies in philosophy, civil liberties, and free speech. He continued on at Oxford, but found the professors there boring and inferior to Glasgow. After proving himself through a series of lectures at the University of Edinburgh, Smith accepted a teaching position at the University of Glasgow, where he taught moral philosophy. Smith became internationally known as a scholar once he published The Theory of Moral Sentiments in 1759. As a professor of moral philosophy, Smith was interested in the logical processes humans undergo in order to make good or bad choices. Whereas the church had decreed morality as constructed solely by God, and David Hume had described morality as a product of what is useful, Smith was interested in the associations or relationships between various parties in a given situation and how the dynamics of these groups define what is morally positive or negative. The theory of moral sentiments explored how the pressures, expectations, traditions, and emotions of individuals interplayed between individuals and groups in determining what was right or wrong. Smith hypothesized that often individuals make moral choices on the basis of how they will be perceived by others. He was interested how particularly one's conscience seemed to speak or pressure an individual into making a certain choice. Smith only left his position at Glasgow when he was offered the opportunity to tutor the stepson of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend. The tutoring position would enable him to think more, travel more, and write more. Smith traveled extensively on the continent and stopped for longer periods in locations such as Toulouse, Geneva, and Paris. Smith met and interacted with both Voltaire and Benjamin Franklin while touring the continent and kept up a regular correspondence with David Hume back in Scotland. While in France, he engaged the physiocrats and considered their economic theories. While the physiocrats asserted that land was the basis of wealth, Smith disagreed and argued the productive labor of a nation's citizens marked the nation's wealth. Smith believed the combined productive powers of a state would always far exceed the value of the gold a state could gather or the amount of land it may occupy. Smith was notoriously absent-minded and prone to talking to himself, a habit that began in childhood and continued in his latter years. He was known to walk into obstacles while lost in his thoughts, or even walk miles and miles from his home before he realized where he was. Smith returned to Scotland and spent most of the next 10 years writing the work that would transform the modern world and forever associate Smith's names with free markets and capitalism. Smith's massive masterpiece was published in 1776. While the full name of the work is entitled An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, it is best known by its shortened title of The Wealth of Nations. It is difficult to overstate the importance of Smith's great work. The Wealth of Nations systematically criticized the prevailing economic system of mercantilism and showed how such a managed economy was flawed and underproductive. Smith also took issue with the physiocrats and their belief that land was equivalent to wealth. For the first time in history, Smith delivered a robust explanation in defense of a free market system, an economic system not managed by a king or bureaucrats or aristocrats, a market of exchange and trade that did not give special benefits to aristocrats or monarchy, but rather was free to enter in and trade and free to depart if a deal could not be made. The free market approach is sometimes called a laissez-faire market, that is, a hands-off or left-alone market. The modern designation for a free market economy is capitalism, that is, an economic system which holds as its goal the acquisition of wealth or capital by its practitioners. The Wealth of Nations was very much a piece influenced by the thinking of the day, as Smith endeavored to discover by reason the natural laws that yield the best system of political economy. Smith believed by using a scientific examination of trade that he had discovered the natural laws that pertain to economics. Smith wrote extensively regarding what he designated as the invisible hand of the market. The invisible hand referred to the natural forces in the market that regulated production, trade, and consumption. A monarch or landowner did not need to exercise a tangible or visible hand in regulating the market. The prevalence of natural resources would naturally and invisibly impact prices. The preference and interest of buyers would naturally and invisibly impact sales. The danger, according to Smith, was for governments to artificially manipulate the market and not let the invisible forces naturally govern trade. Smith also highlighted the importance of self-interest in a free market. By self-interest, Smith did not mean selfishness. He meant that every worker, looking after his own interest and that of his family, got out of bed in the morning and went to work to produce. He may have been doing so in his own interest, but in the process he was contributing to the productive capacity of his community and increasing the wealth of his nation. Smith saw competition as essential and beneficial in a free market economy. Smith did not associate competition with cutthroat ruthlessness in which one worker or business stepped on another. He saw competition between producers as a natural phenomenon that improved the products available to everyone and helped to reduce prices. If to do well, one salesman had to offer a better product at a lower price than another, then it is the buyer who ultimately benefits. Smith also discussed how the invisible hand of the market would naturally regulate the supply of goods and the demand for goods. Government did not need to impose regulations on production. Nature would do so on its own. Natural resources, availability of workers, and production costs naturally determine how much of a certain good is available to consumers. The same is true for the demand of goods. Consumer demand will naturally regulate production and pricing. If there's a shortage of a good in demand, then the price will go up. If there is an abundance of the same good and it does not represent what people want, then the price will go down. Freely and naturally, the market will set the price regarding supply and demand. Smith famously used the illustration of a pin factory to explain the principle of the division of labor. Smith called the attention of his readers to the workers in a pin factory. He pointed out that if a single worker is charged with taking all the steps necessary for the construction of a single pin, gathering the raw materials, straightening the metal, cutting it, grinding it, refining it, polishing it, and presenting it, then that worker could probably make about 1 pin per day, and certainly not more than 20 pins per day. But if the workers in a factory each are assigned a single task, one worker will straighten, one will cut, one will grind, one will polish, then efficiency will increase, and the number of pins produced each day will increase into the tens of thousands. Dividing up the tasks of labor is a natural law that will yield greater efficiency and production. Related to the division of labor, Smith discussed what he called the absolute advantage of a single business or nation as the ability to produce a good or service more efficiently than a competitor. Nations could expand their wealth, according to Smith, if they concentrated on what they produce best, based on their natural resources and workers, and then trade for the rest. A free trade was the best trading system, according to Smith, because nations could concentrate their strengths and freely acquire the rest from their trading partners. The Wealth of Nations was popular and very well received upon its publication. First edition copies quickly sold out in the first 6 months. Smith quickly became a friend of the American colonists, as his book was published in the very same year as the American Declaration of Independence was signed. Smith criticized the system of colonies that made up the British Empire and the special government favors that imperial companies like the British East India Company received. Smith advocated for the freedom of the colonies to promote a more pure and free system of trade and productivity. As a result, American founding fathers such as Franklin, Madison, and Jefferson came to appreciate Smith and quoted The Wealth of Nations. Karl Marx and communist sympathizers would heavily criticize Smith's free market theories in the following century, believing a large capitalist system can only be built on the backs of oppressed workers. Adam Smith would once again achieve fame in the 20th century as a new appreciation for his ideas emerged, and the benefits of a free market and free trade were evident in pulling third world nations out of poverty and into the modern era. In May of 1773, Smith was elected Fellow of the Royal Society of London and was elected a member of the Literary Club in 1775. Smith was appointed as a commissioner of customs later in his life and was one of the founding members of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. After a painful illness, Smith died in 1790. On his deathbed, he expressed regret that he had not achieved more in life. He was buried in Canongate Kirkyard. He remains today as one of the most significant thinkers in the field of economics ever. Enlightenment philosophers were interested in a broad range of subjects, even beyond government and economics. The Italian philosopher Cesare Beccaria was a philosopher, jurist, and politician who had a significant influence on the development of the modern criminal justice system. Beccaria was from a well-to-do Italian noble family and was well educated in politics and economics. He took a rare interest in criminal justice and the treatment of prisoners, whom most philosophers did not even consider worth reflection. For his significant contributions to the study of justice, he is often considered the father of modern criminal justice. The work Beccaria best became known for was his On Crimes and Punishments. While not a particularly long work, the appeal of the treatise was in its practical applications rather than being overly theoretical. On Crimes and Punishments protests against torture to obtain confessions, secret accusations, the arbitrary discretionary power of judges, the inconsistency and inequality of sentencing, using personal connections to get a lighter sentence, and the use of capital punishment for serious and even minor offenses. Beccaria's work was a significant step away from the brutal, punitive system of justice from the medieval period, and a step towards adjusting the focus of criminal justice towards the rehabilitation and restoration of criminals. It was an enlightened call away from punishment and towards restoration. Some of his key ideas remain hotly debated today, including truth in sentencing, swift punishment, and the abolishment of the death penalty. Beccaria was a pioneer in criminology, and he had a profound influence on shaping the rights delineated in the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights. On Crimes and Punishments had a great influence on the American founding fathers. Another philosopher who carried broad appeal during the Enlightenment was Marie Jean-Antoine Nicolas de Caratach, best remembered as the Marquis de Condorcet. Condorcet was a philosopher and a mathematician whose ideas addressed a multitude of areas, including economics, public education, constitutional government, and equality for women in all races. Condorcet is remembered as one who may have best embodied the ideas of the Enlightenment. Condorcet was educated as a mathematician and published numerous papers, including one on integral calculus. He was the member of numerous philosophical and scientific societies, including the American Philosophical Society, the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Condorcet was particularly inspired by the American Revolution and applied the language of liberty to a multitude of groups, including women and blacks. More than anything, Condorcet brought to the center a recurring focus on equality as a rational goal for states to aspire. He attacked privilege in all its forms and believed, quite uniquely, that women held a unique equal station with men. He rejected biological determinism as a factor in the creation of the sexes and believed the concepts of male and female were social constructions that paternalistic societies developed to protect the power of men. Besides his focus on the principle of equality, Condorcet was also enamored with the strong belief in progress. He demonstrated his belief in human improvement in his well-received work, Sketch for a Historical Picture of the Progress of the Human Mind. Condorcet traces the progression of man away from his primitive superstitions and away from the ignorance of religion towards the enlightened rational mind. It was the rational mind that, according to Condorcet, gave birth to the scientific revolution, and now that science had been liberated, rational man will apply the same scientific principles to the study of society, resulting in the creation of a perfect society. Perfectibility, a rational population, and enduring direct democracy were all attainable goals now that man's ability to reason had been unleashed. Condorcet's belief in the importance of education for a successful democracy was pivotal. Revolutions were temporary, but self-government could endure if a citizenry prized free and public education above religious superstition and ignorance. Morality stemmed from a well-educated, rational being. The hope for a progressive, enlightened civil society was in a well-educated and rational populace. The irony of Condorcet's life was that despite his advocacy for a rational, enlightened population practicing direct and unlimited democracy, his own life was destroyed once these ideas were enlisted in France during the French Revolution. Condorcet was accused of treason and died in prison while the very enlightened creatures he created were in power. His optimism for a perfect world was certainly mitigated by the realities of which were released by his own ideas. Philosophy and science were the twin obsessions during the Enlightenment, which represented a marked shift away from the Reformation with its focus on theology. Accompanying this new belief in the power of man's reason and philosophical speculation was a growing criticism and even rejection of Europe's historic Christianity. The Scottish philosopher David Hume, despite his other many varied gifts and accomplishments, is often strongly associated with this new critique of the Bible and faith. David Hume was born on the north side of Edinburgh. His father died when he was very young, and he was raised by his mother. David Hume never married or sired children, but he obviously showed strong intellectual gifts at a young age and enrolled at the University of Edinburgh at the age of 12 and possibly younger. Hume held his professors in contempt and never actually graduated from the University of Edinburgh. Hume had very little money in the early part of his career and was denied various university positions because of his atheism. He did enjoy some success, though, as an essayist, and eventually secured a position as a librarian at the University of Edinburgh. Hume worked for 4 years on his first major work, A Treatise of Human Nature, subtitled, being an attempt to introduce the experimental method of reasoning into moral subjects, completing it in 1738 at the age of 28. Although many scholars today consider the treatise to be Hume's most important work and one of the most important books in Western philosophy, critics in Great Britain at the time described it as abstract and unintelligible. Hume most ardently is associated with the philosophy of empiricism. According to Hume, experience and sensation and experimentation are everything. Truth is not derived from revelation, from a priest, or from a holy book. All that we can possibly know must be arrived at by what we can prove. This obsession with empiricism led Hume to be an arch critic of miracles and anything supernatural. He attributed any spiritual experience to simply man's sensations and the collision of his passions. Hume actually diminished the exalted role that reason enjoyed by most philosophers during the Enlightenment and chose rather to focus on man's passions and emotions. He even went so far as to say, quote, reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions, unquote. Hume rejected the proposition that man even has an identifiable, reasonable self. Rather, man is a collection of sentiments that exhibit little coherence or order. Hume also composed his massive History of England, which took 15 years to write and reached 1 million words. The work was well received and became the standard history of England for years to come. It made Hume a well-respected writer and drew attention to his other works as well. Near the end of his life, Hume spent time in Paris and for a time befriended Rousseau before a very public falling out. Hume died of stomach cancer in Edinburgh, still refusing to believe in the existence of an afterlife. He is buried in Edinburgh today. An even greater critic of historic Christianity and the doctrines of faith was Paul-Henri Thierry, better remembered as the Baron d'Holbach. D'Holbach was a Franco-German philosopher, encyclopedist, writer, and philosopher. Although born in the German states, he lived most of his life in Paris, where he hosted a salon. D'Holbach corresponded with some of the leading philosophes of the day, and many of his more controversial writings were not discovered to be his until years after his death. Although D'Holbach wrote extensively on a broad range of subjects, he is best remembered today for his anti-religious essays. D'Holbach published his attacks on Christianity anonymously or under pseudonyms and had them printed outside of France. D'Holbach argued Christianity impeded the moral improvement of individuals. In his major work, The System of Nature, D'Holbach declared there was no God, creator, or intelligent designer to the universe. Men and creatures are simply matter in motion, forming and dying due to natural causes and natural laws. The world is a large machine, and humans are simply more machines in the larger system. The idea of God is a human invention for moral comfort and to control others. Christianity provided no moral basis for behavior. Man should pursue his own happiness as an ethical system. When he is happy, then man will find liberty and protect that liberty. Barndall Bach is often considered Europe's first self-described atheist and is considered the forerunner of many religious skeptics to come into the following century. The attack on Christianity continued in the historical writings of the Englishman Edward Gibbon. Gibbon heavily criticized the common approach taken in the writing of history. He rejected his superstitious, medieval historians' obsession with miracles and the triumph of Christianity. Gibbon undertook a more secular view of history and believed it should be studied with the same scientific examination and empiricism employed in other fields during the Enlightenment. Gibbon's greatest work was his History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which was published in 6 volumes from 1776 to 1789. Gibbon paid a new attention to primary sources and dug deep to authenticate his sources in order to validate his work. While many found his Decline and Fall a stirring and engaging narrative, many refused to adopt Gibbon's central thesis. For Gibbon argues that the glorious Roman Empire fell primarily because of the advent and spread of Christianity. Gibbon blames Christianity for Rome losing its vitality, patriotism, sacrifice, and power. Christians turned inward away from patriotically caring about Rome. Christian churches diverted large sums of money for what could have otherwise been used to expand the empire. According to Gibbon, too many Christians became ascetic monks and nuns for the empire to maintain its strength and durability. Many subsequent historians would follow Gibbon and point out the errors in his thesis and dismiss his conclusions, but no one doubted the impressive breadth of his work or his engaging style. The history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire once again shows the Enlightenment's focus on reason could be applied to even unexpected areas such as historical writing. The Enlightenment was not exclusively dominated by male writers and contributors. Women played a crucial role in the dissemination of the new ideas. They also served as hostesses for salons and editors of great works. Some even contributed their own thoughts and essays to the movement. Émilie du Châtelet was one of the most impressive women of the Enlightenment. She was a wife and a mother, but also a mathematician and philosopher. She held a long-standing close relationship with Voltaire himself. Châtelet famously translated Newton's Principia into French and provided explanatory commentary along the way. Her translation of the Principia remains the standard French language version still today. She even added some of her own postulates to Newton's system of mechanical physics. Mary Estelle was an English writer sometimes called the first English feminist. She called for equal access to education for young girls and women, and withdrew from public life to manage her own girls' school. Estelle was no radical, though. Although she called for men and women to be treated equally in their intellectual gifts and capabilities, she also believed in the value of religion and relationships between women, and also called for passive obedience to the state and submission to the prevailing government. More radical for the time were the writings and career of Mary Wollstonecraft. She called for the equality of the sexes and enlarged access for women to better education in her groundbreaking work, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, published in 1792. Wollstonecraft's radical feminist views would fall out of disfavor in the 19th century due to her torrid private life, but the modern feminist movement would look back on her with praise in the 20th century. The Age of Reason also had a profound effect on several writers and thinkers in the American colonies. Many Enlightenment ideas became important in the drafting of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. Discussion of ideas such as liberty, the freedoms of speech, press, assembly, petition, and religion, the separation of powers, and a humane criminal justice system were all concepts from the Enlightenment that profoundly influenced the American founding fathers. The Massachusetts lawyer and revolutionary John Adams was well read in Enlightenment thought and the classics of political theory. His draft of the Massachusetts state constitution with a bicameral, that is, two-house legislature, influenced the United States Constitution to include also a bicameral Congress with the House of Representatives and the United States Senate. Although an Englishman from the majority of his life, Joseph Priestley was a philosopher and a scientist who garnered widespread acceptance in the American colonies and then the young United States. As a scientist, Priestley independently discovered oxygen, and as a philosopher, he helped found Unitarianism in England. Because of his controversial support for both the American and French Revolution, Priestley was forced to flee to the United States, where he died at the age of 70 in 1804. Thomas Jefferson, the Virginia lawyer, read all the classical and Enlightenment political philosophers and included many of these ideas, particularly those of John Locke, into his drafting of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson was similarly impacted by enlightened skepticism and became a deist and edited his own version of the New Testament. Benjamin Franklin was, no doubt, the most internationally famous American during the colonial period. As an inventor, writer, philosopher, and scientist, he was well accepted in Europe and attracted greater respect for Americans because of his notable contributions. Thomas Paine was a philosopher and writer who became famous for his pamphlets advocating for American independence, such as Common Sense and The American Crisis. But he was attacked and rejected in his latter years because of his atheism, stemming from the publication of his pamphlet, The Age of Reason. In the pamphlet, Paine had written, quote, "My mind is my church," unquote. James Madison may have been the most brilliant of political theorists during the age of America's Revolution. He largely single-handedly drafted the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and is still known today as the father of the Constitution. His lavish borrowing of the contract theory of government, the separation of powers, and an individual's civil liberties was heavily lifted from Enlightenment-era works. The impact of the Enlightenment on the early United States shows the broad international appeal the movement held for individuals and states well beyond the salons of Paris and the debating societies of Europe. Although born in Europe, it is clear the Enlightenment quickly expanded beyond its borders and continued to influence the thinking of men and women around the world still today.